so I'm going to jump in and kind of talk to you guys a little bit about some of the work we've done at IDEO Colab Ventures. So over the last year plus, we've been working with a number of DeFi teams and protocols, pool together and future swap and things. And tonight I want to share some of the kind of interesting things that have shaken out from a number of the sessions. So it's the SAFG, which we'll get into what it means. It's a simple agreement for future governance. It has nothing to do with a legal agreement, but we'll kind of get into some of the patterns of it. So, all right, in a nutshell, it's like, there's a lot of unique challenges to building money Legos. And in truth, it's like we talk a lot about making things really easy, right? Composability and all the ease that goes along with this. But in truth, it's really, really challenging. And in the last couple of months, and especially in 2020, we've seen a number of attacks that have shown just how challenging it is to build and ship a functional product in this space. It's very different than than just your typical product. And so building and shipping is hard, and here's specifically why, like across a couple of items. So, governance specifically, there's a question around, what are the best ways for teams to distribute governance rights to incentivize a really well-informed community about how to manage long-term development of their project, right? You're handing this thing over and you want to really engage the community. So how do you actually, how do you do that functionally? Another one is, the economic incentives. So how do teams, add the right incentive mechanisms that make the most sense based on the stage of the project, right? Because if you try too much at the right stage, you can get bloated. You deal with compliance issues and a whole sort of things. On security, the more code you write, the more at risk you are, obviously. And so the question becomes like, what's the balance for teams to ship early protocols and products that are really lean, but still give them a really good chance of success in terms of testing what they need to test? Because security, we've seen there's just a number of ways to kind of get at different protocols. And then, depending upon where you are in terms of your stage or desire to comply, regulatory compliance is definitely a thing. And so, how can teams set themselves up and their communities up to build new incentive models once certain levels of decentralization are met? And so I realized all these kind of bullet points that I'm talking about, we talk about generally. And it's really hard because it's like a lot of these things, a lot of projects are doing these things, but they're doing them for the first time. But what I'm going to share tonight is kind of that I think there's a dominant design pattern that we've seen emerge, or that we're watching emerge. It's not cemented by any shape. And for this next phase of kind of like protocol development, I think we're kind of getting to that moment. And speaking of kind of this hints at progressive decentralization, right? Jesse wrote about this a while back, and progressive centralization is great. But is there an actual path for teams to get to this place? Because what we need are some meaningful strategies to make, and meaningful ways to like measure progress and achieve the outcome and how to get there. So all in all, what I just kind of threw out there is a lot of questions, right? Governance, economics, and things like this, and it covers a lot of ground. But what we'll get into is I think that we've got glimmers of an answer starting to show up. We've talked with a number of protocols about about this thing, and we've had a number of inbound, and we're also seeing it start to show up in the wild, which is pretty exciting. So with all that said, let's kind of dive into exactly what it is that we're seeing. So the SAFG, which again is this simple agreement for future governance, what it does is it kind of gives us this shared language and a flexible framework that we can use to understand strategies across various DeFi projects in the space, right? And so, like, let's just take a couple examples that are listed on the page here. You've got Compound, which is, we all know Compound, algorithmic autonomous interest rate protocol, but it's a little bit, it's more mature than the other ones on this page. It's got a lot of assets under management in terms of contracts, and they do things in a very measured and deliberate way in terms of compliance and how they build. So you've got them on one end of the spectrum. You've got, Future Swap, which is this new perpetual futures market with 20x leverage, no slippage, AMM based, which is brand new. They just launched a really successful alpha and shut it down to do the next round before going live. And so they're relatively younger. They have different compliance issues, smaller community, less assets under contract. So they're on kind of this other end of the spectrum. Then you have Balancer. We all kind of know what Balancer is, but on-chain liquidity, different types of bonding curves that create effectively index funds for you. But they're in another place in terms of both age, community development. And then another one was curve finance, effectively non-custodial portfolio management and price sensor. So what we're seeing here is that all of these projects within the last 2 months have gone to market with this notion of a simple governance token. And all of these projects, Balancer, Curve, Compound, and FutureSwap, are all in different places in terms of project lifecycle, age, maturity, compliance requirements, community development, community engagement and involvement, and asset. So like, what's interesting to note here is that if we were looking for a framework or a playbook that allowed us to get to design decentralization, it would be something that's flexible and directly applicable to projects kind of across a spread. And so what we're seeing here is that across a diversity of compositions, we have a similar playbook that has only recently emerged. I mean, it was only within the last week we saw Curve tweet about it. Balancer announced it several weeks prior. So I mean, we're really at the edge here. But the reason we're shooting for this common language is because a common language or a framework is really what allows us to design things with intention going forward, instead of kind of shooting from the hip and shooting in the dark, which is effectively what we're doing across all these projects right now. But it really allows us to, we want to get to a point where we can track what's working and what's not. And so what is this agreement for future governance? What it's really about is two things fundamentally. It's about participation and governance. And so, in principle, what it means is that the governance token or governance is only distributed through authentic participation with the protocol. And so what that means is this. It means the first property is that the only way to acquire the right to govern is through authentically participating in the protocol. So, in FutureSwap, for example, the only way to earn FST is to provide liquidity, to be a trader, or to be a referral. But anyway, any of those actions are driving value to the protocol, and you learn something about it by interfacing with it. But you can't acquire the token on the open market, and initially it's non-transferable. Those things have to be voted in or governed in at some point in time, possibly. But the second property of this, if the first one is just participation to acquire the right, the second one is that really the only thing you're guaranteed to get out of this is the right to govern. That's all. So token holders are effectively only guaranteed that right, and that's it. You're only guaranteed the right to kind of guide this thing's future initially. The changes come downstream, and that's where it gets interesting. But what this helps to do is there's a number of side effects and benefits, which we'll get into here in a little bit. So yeah, in a nutshell, what we have, and I think what we're seeing here is this kind of emerging DeFi playbook. All right, this is going to sound like a plug, and it kind of is, but it's like this emerged from a lot of prototyping over a lot of months with a handful of DeFi companies, right? So it's part of the DNA is this like rapid prototyping. I know a lot of people talk about it, but this is actually how this emerged. And it was iterative, it was pretty hands-on, and it was prototyping and designing at the edge of protocols, and designing and building and learning from the community. And so what this is this is our attempt to generalize and share this kind of pattern with you guys today. But effectively, when you understand the SAFG, which we'll get into the benefits of now, what it really lets you do is design effective economic incentive strategies, like token distribution mechanics that work effectively, governance actions that can be in the right hands of the right people, and metrics to track success. And those four vectors are, I think, lacking in a lot of ways here. So what we've got here is the simple agreement for future governance. And I want to land the fact that the SAFG is not a legal document. Really, the language was just used to provide a conceptual anchor point for people so that they go, oh, simple agreement for future something. So it's not a legal document. What this is it's a playbook, and it's an agreement between the project and its community. And it's a foundation effectively for expressing Oops, got to double click the slides to make them big. Whoops, I'm getting a heads up. Okay, I don't know if I can full size these things. Sorry, but anyways, what we've got here is it's not a legal document. What it is it's kind of this foundation for expressing coding and shipping new models of protocols with design, with participation and governance kind of built in. And so again, it's a concept, it's a functional DeFi framework that I think represents an emerging and dominant design pattern that protocols can use to build with their communities over time. And that's a really powerful primitive. And so we've seen that it's general enough, you know, in kind of looking at those projects, we've seen it's general enough to work across a variety of projects at different places in their life cycle and size. But you know, but what's kind of at the core of this is that there's a fundamental shift underway, and in you know, like one way of just kind of like putting a nice little bow on the sense of this shift is that what we're doing is we're shifting away from a world of buying to own into a world of participating to govern, or not necessarily, or it's better stated, it's we're participating for the right to govern. If typically, you know, in the prior generation of protocols, investors effectively, or anybody, could go onto the open market and buy tokens, and then you had, you know, rights that were just, everything was just kind of baked in. You had this bloat kind of baked in. Now you're saying, wait a second, you can't just go acquire this. You pare down governance to the bare minimum of just the fact that you can make decisions. And what this actually does is it allows projects to, we'll kind of see this, but it allows projects to launch faster and create economic models that are very directly tailored to their communities and their needs, and functionally kind of align the long-term interests of participants, which is really interesting. So what we think is that this SAFG is a flexible DeFi primitive with a number of benefits. And so we'll kind of take a little walk through kind of the 4 key areas, because we talked about them a little bit above, but we'll go into depth here. So, you know, one of the primary one is governance, right? So in this case, the 2 simple properties of governance and participation, they shake out into this. So governance tokens are only distributed through authentic participation. And so, you know, the benefits of this are almost, they're so obvious, and the power of this is so obvious that it's overlooked by nearly everyone that we've talked to, which is why we're going to break it down like this. But distribution by way of authentic participation, and without an open market like acquisition and transfer mechanism baked in, it reduces a certain type of speculative risk, right? Because if people are just getting involved for speculation, chances are, and there's no guarantee of future return baked in, you know, chances are for less risk, they can go speculate elsewhere. So there'll still be a certain amount of speculation baked in, but what that means is that the people who authentically participate in the protocol are the ones who care likely about the long-term kind of evolution of the incentive mechanisms and are a little bit more aligned. And so what that also means is that the people who are participating are the ones that hold the most. And so the second factor is decision-making is now in the hands of the people who use the protocol the most. And so when governance tokens are effectively only acquired by way of participation, that means the top decision makers in the community, they at first clearly understood their role in the downstream value capture and design, and they're putting themselves in a position to make those decisions ahead of time. You haven't seen something like this in the years prior. So that's a really interesting kind of dynamic that starts to set itself up when you strip all these things away. Looking at economic incentives. So when you effectively punt the economic mechanisms downstream to say that we're going to design it when it's appropriate and what's appropriate, what you have the ability to do is kind of defer complex questions to allow the core team to function or to focus on the mechanics that are required for success of the protocol. And so, you know, this type of flexibility, and when the community understands that this flexibility is required and understands this type of plan to build in tailored economics downstream, you have a much more engaged group that understands that the team is not, that allows the team to ship more pared down versions sooner, focusing on just the fundamentals. So there's a nature of patience that the community then starts to show up with in terms of how this develops. And again, the economic incentives are now added on at the right moment. So, you know, teams, one sec here. So teams are effectively no longer forced to to expend resources to build in all the economic, you know, libraries and things like that, or mechanisms at the beginning and ship with that. What it allows them to do is just build this in over time as it's required. And this has, again, some shakeout benefits that we're going to keep getting into. But again, it just keeps, as you dive into, when you strip things away, you really get to understand what they are. So then security, right? DeFi it's all about security, right? So when you defer unnecessary complexity and you reduce the time to market, you can reduce the time to market, and you're also you're putting the more challenging aspects of protocol development a little bit downstream, so you can get to market faster with something that's a little bit more secure. So there's less complexity and a little bit, and actually a lot tighter of a surface area, right? You reduce the V1 features to improve security, right? Put really clearly, less code is less room for bugs and unmitigated attacks. And teams that understand this and apply this as kind of a playbook, they really can get into a cadence of shipping leaner, more secure early releases. We've seen the kind of danger of it's not like it's unwarranted danger, right? There's a time and a place to ship early alpha protocols in DeFi, and the liquidity providers understand the risks. And when the red flags are up, I'm all for it. But it's just how can we do this better? Again, it's about not shooting from the hip, but improving the process and becoming better at shipping these types of protocols into the market. And then finally, compliance. So depending upon where you are, when you say that there's no economic value mechanism baked into the governance token at day zero, what you've done is you have no immediate capture, and so you're compliant, right? There's no hint of revenue bearing anything on these tokens. And so you can ship immediately or as fast as you're able to without the hairball of regulatory concerns. And also, really important, it's without watering down or hampering the protocol or the vision for the protocol, which I think is important. And again, the secondary thing is you have economics to match the level of decentralization. So, what we have at this point is, in the early stages of let's say FutureSwap and Compound, what we have is a level of centralization was started with, and as things start to kind of grow and move forward, distributions and incentive mechanisms will be built in, but only not built in by the central company. It'll be governed in by the largest token holders and the people who have largely taken part in the protocol since its early stages and who understand it really well. And in terms of distribution mechanisms, that's one of the trickiest. It's one of the most interesting areas of design. Because I think we saw Balancer is going to be doing Curve is going to be doing backwards looking. So people who have been participating from the beginning will be taken care of. So again, across all these vectors, we have just a slew of benefits that can now be measured, understood, and directly applied with shared language and understanding. And across a variety of projects, now we can start to categorize and understand the nature of experimentation and what is working and what is not, and share language. And again, when you don't have shared language, you don't have shared understanding. It just seems like everything is disparate. But I think what we're starting to have here is this like shared field of understanding for how we can continue to improve this. So what this is in essence, I think, is we've got a new phase of designing with your users. And at IDEO, it's like baked into the DNA, right? Design with your users. But what I'm pretty stoked about is the fact that this is actually designing protocols and communities with your users by way of making things much more simple and then designing in the appropriate mechanisms at the appropriate time. And there's immense power in simplicity. And when you reduce complexity and you use these really simple primitives to build complex things, I think amazing things happen, and we're starting to see that. So it's a new phase, but what's also kind of cool is that you get progressive decentralization as a side effect of applying this type of playbook or framework. And the fact that it has emerged kind of organically out of some of the work we've done in some of these other projects that we're seeing now, we've got a lot of inbound in terms of wanting to explore what this means, because a side effect and a directly applicable approach to something that we've been talking about for a long time, but a way to share that and to evolve that as an industry, I think is something that's really powerful. So anyways, all that said, is that it's DeFi's early stages, right? And so the playbooks are being written. And so what this is this is my invitation. I think this is our invitation to write this playbook together. So feel free to reach out, to ask questions, to share a little bit more about this. And yeah, I think that's about it. So Dan, if you want to hop back in and
great.
transition.
Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah,
since you published that piece a few weeks ago, we've seen more and more teams announcing that they're going this route, and we're getting a lot of folks reaching out saying they're thinking about it. So it's I'm sure it'll be a continued topic of conversation over the rest of this session, and then in the weeks and months ahead, laying the groundwork for us.